Content warning. This story contains scenes of domestic violence and racial humiliation. All evening, the chandeliers hummed like insects. Crystal caught the light and threw it back in hundredfold. Heels kept time on marble. Servers moved in silent choreography. It was the Montgomery Foundation Gala, and everything in the room had been arranged to suggest inevitability. Long history, older money, names vetted and polished until they shone. Briana Underwood Montgomery stood on the terrace for a moment and let the city breathe across her face. A soft wind lifted the hem of her emerald gown. The fabric brushed her belly, a small, warm reassurance against the world's pressure. She kept her hands low, fingers loose, as if she wanted to feel the baby's small constancy against the noise. She had arrived from Newark after a shift at the clinic, after a meeting with volunteers about the new mobile literacy van. She had flown in from a day of late-night calls arranging books and tutors for neighborhoods that the Foundation's board always described as projects, never people. She had the same tired ring under her eyes she had when she lectured at Harvard, the same quiet that made her a leader because she listened first and spoke second. Around her, the room was designed to make her invisible. Not by accident. The erasure was slow, social, almost surgical. The wrong women sat in her row. A hostess placed a name card closer into shadow, turned it so that the printed letters caught the light wrong. Someone laughed a little too loudly when one of Briana's sentences ran a beat too long. Her name on the guest list existed in the marble registry of the evening, but around the table, the spaces she had built for other women, reading rooms, scholarship funds, the small literacy program in her name, were spoken of as if they belonged to the Foundation's donors, not to the woman who'd built them. Sloane Whitfield was effortless in white. Where Briana's dress suggested a life in progress, midwifery-toned, practical elegance, Sloane's gown was sculpted to the idea of untouchable wealth. Precise pleats, exactly the right cuff of diamonds, a haircut that suggested the angle of a corporation's letterhead. Sloane had the kind of smile that demanded an audience and took one without asking. Tonight, she circled the table like a current, stirring rumor into the water. Sloane's arrival at the Foundation had been recent, framed by glossy magazine profiles and escorted by a kindly, distant hand. Richard Montgomery III, the heir. Not a husband, an heir. The room welcomed his name as if fortune were a religion. Sloane had learned quickly how to wear invitations like armor. She was a public relations professional in her own right, a practiced presence who could make every camera angle seem designed for her. She also understood the most brutal currency of the room: narrative. The first slight happened with a card. A fluted host dropped it from a tray. A white-gloved hand scooped it up and, with a careless turn, positioned it where Briana would have to look twice to see it. The second slight was softer, almost elegant. The chairman asked Briana to stand for a moment and be recognized, only to forget to mention the program that bore her name. The applause that followed was polite, engineered. It praised the Foundation's newest initiatives that somehow did not require the person who had started the program. Briana felt the air tighten. She kept her voice steady when she spoke. About a new pilot for reading mentors. About Maya, a child from the program who read aloud with a voice that surprised everyone. And the room smiled at the story as if she were a pleasant footnote. Somewhere in the marble sunlight, someone made a toast to tradition and keeping standards. Briana thought, uncharitably, of the way the word sounded like a coat hung to hide something fragile. Across the terrace, Gloria Montgomery watched with a face that had learned not to be seen as a mother, but as an institution. Her hands were arranged so that her rings were visible, the old money signal. She had a smile like a shutter closing. When she glanced at Sloane, it was the look of ownership. Sloane returned it with a practiced inside laugh, as if the joke were private,
and the rest of them were obedient to the punchline. That was the atmosphere when the first cameras went up. Phones, those small, bright witnesses, lifted in halting unison. People loved spectacle when it performed proper power. They did not love the discomfort of seeing a narrative that upended the choreography of their assumptions. They loved the image of a woman in green making a brave speech. They did not love the messy details that might suggest this was not only a narrative about charity, but a conflict about who belonged. The escalation was surgical, small gestures compounded until they hardened. Briana's valet slipped away with the charity brochure she had authored. A luncheon invitation was misplaced. Volunteers were told to sit elsewhere, or worse, to speak only of the Empire's vision. Sloane leaned close at a telling moment and said, under her breath with the practiced sweetness of a spider, "You don't belong here." Not loud, not dramatic, precise. The room heard nothing but the way the phrase landed in Briana's chest like a cold hand. The assault was a single, brutal line drawn in public. A photograph later would show 5 seconds. Sloane advancing, a cluster of onlookers frozen in a tableau. Briana's hand rose to her belly to protect the small life there. The room's music blurred. In one breathless instant, a leg, white, flawless, polished, connected with the curve of Briana's abdomen. It was a hit calculated for spectacle. It would be visible enough to humiliate, public enough to make silence an accessory. It was not the only violence that night. The second violence was the room's response.
Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. Phones blossomed into light as people captured and deferred. No hand reached for Briana at first. The camera never lied. It only showed the truth of the room's choice. Briana staggered without theatrics. She did not scream. The sound that followed was small and precise. A chair scraping, a fork falling. Someone said, "Oh my God." Someone else said, "Is she all right?" But the words were more ritual than act. Sloane's face was practiced innocence, airbrushed faux concern for a moment she had manufactured into history. The rest of the night collapsed into the particular geometry of emergency. Claret stained a napkin. Someone wrapped a shawl around Briana's shoulders. A valet called an ambulance. Richard's expression was a map of calculation. Quick apologies that reached no human corners. He had the look of a man taught to trade emotion for optics. His hands moved to smooth fabric, to move himself into the position of conciliator. Later, when tabloids ran headlines and someone wrote about a domestic incident, the photograph of his composed jaw would be cropped into evidence of his neutrality. At St. Augustine's, where her clinic had once sent the volunteers for health screenings, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo waited with the clinical calm of someone who had seen enough human bodies to know how fragile plans were. The baby's heart beat steady. The monitor's beeps punctuated the air like an indifferent metronome. The obstetrician's hand on Briana's shoulder was professional and gentle. "We'll keep you for observation," she said. "No risks taken." Her tone was plain, agency, not pity. The fetal heart rate remained inside the safe arc the machine drew, a thin line people could trust when they did not trust each other. Some things could be fixed with medical language. Most could not. She was bandaged and taped and scanned. They gave her food she could keep down. They made protective decisions, all of them small, a buffer of time against the world. But in between the IVs and the gentle clinical reassurances came other hands. A lawyer's card, a staff member's low voice insisting she sign some innocuous-sounding form. Words like protecting the family and resolving the embarrassment floated like syrup. Richard's counsel arrived with the kind of politeness that was always calculative. He came to the hospital with a small leather folder. His apology was the careful kind constructed to appease cameras and preserve status. He offered options in sentences shaped for attorneys. "We can have this handled quietly," he said, as if whispering through a phone to a bank. "An annulment will let you move on. We will make sure you're compensated. For privacy, for your health." He slid the folder across the bedside table in the way only men who've never been refused by the world slide things across rooms, expecting them to be opened and swallowed. Briana read the papers as if she were examining a strange artifact. There was an offer.
There was a clause about non-disparagement. There was a confidentiality agreement thinly veiled as compassion. The accounts shown on the pages were a ledger best read by those taught to read power. Transfers designated for discretionary oversight, a trust that could be rearranged by the right signature. Within days, her joint accounts, those she'd shared with Richard and those designated to support the reading programs, were frozen by a corporate council who spoke in perfunctory sentences. Donations rerouted. Her program's operating budget put on pause for auditing. It was astonishing in its ordinary precision. The machinery of the elite did not need to make an argument for her erasure. It needed only a signature. Tabloid narratives moved like a feed of small tragedies. They rewove the night into a frame that eased the public's discomfort. A story about a woman under stress, about marital discord, about a nervous breakdown. Photos were chosen that suggested a feverish instability. An exhausted face interpreted as guilty. Sloane's PR team composed a statement about misunderstandings and emotional volatility. There were color-coded timelines and think pieces questioning why a woman with Briana's platform was at such a gala to begin with. The Foundation's spokespeople offered a bland expression of regret that any confrontation occurred, while their legal team crafted a cooling statement, the kind that would first soothe donors and then erode any appetite to fund a fight. Inside that erosion, words meant to support her were replaced by paperwork that controlled her life. Her medical privileges to consult for certain clinics were questioned by committees that had never publicly questioned a white man's competence. Invitations to speak at symposiums were quietly rescinded. A probe into her nonprofit's oversight was announced by the Foundation's board, ostensibly to ensure compliance. It felt less like an audit and more like an excision. Briana's brothers, Malcolm, Desmond, Isaac, were not public faces in the same way. Malcolm, the eldest, ran a technology company with a deftness for strategy. He could make numbers stop being enemies. Desmond managed finances, the quieter, smarter sibling who spoke through spreadsheets and family counsel. Isaac, the lawyer, spoke in human rights language and had once argued free speech cases that made judges awkward. The three men had spent their lives building parallel forms of power that were not always visible on society's main stage. They were practical where the gala was theatrical. They were an answering force when the social world wanted to behave like a tribunal. When Briana called, it was late. Her fingers trembled against the phone, not from physical collapse, but from the fatigue of being continually asked to become smaller. Malcolm picked up first, voice steady in a way she had always found soothing. "What happened?" he asked, and the simplicity of the question was a kind of promise.
She told them the shape of the assault without theatrical detail. She spoke of the name card and the shove, of the empty corridors that followed. Her brother's reply was immediate, a plan forming like a shadow. "We'll be there," Desmond said, short. "We're putting things in motion." Isaac's voice grew busy with legal language. Witnesses, documentation, forensic metadata. "Phones, footage," he said. "We'll get everything." It was not rescue as heroism. It was contingency as strategy. For the first time in days, Briana felt the cool of chosen kin. Not pity, not the offset that came in the leather folder at the hospital. The brothers' support felt calibrated. They would act in ways the public could not easily object to and that the law would recognize. They did not promise a dramatic confrontation. They promised the paperwork that would make drama unnecessary. They had money, yes. They had the pieces that moved. But it was their understanding of what record and order could do, how to use forensic data, how to ensure chain of custody, how to secure testimony, that steadied her. Then came Gloria's visit. She arrived at the hospital with the inevitability of weather and the kind of charm that had been tuned over a lifetime to the right decibel. Her perfume was a clean, retro thing, lavender and money. She came with a tray of things meant to nurse a daughter: tea, a folded blanket, a letter of condolence rehearsed and trimmed. Her smile, once maternal, had narrowed into projection. "You should understand," Gloria said, as if speaking to a child who had misread a book. She framed the evening with antique logic: the preservation of lineage, the dangers of scandal, the necessity of certain social alignments. She used words like purity and family, and in her voice the words wore an old armor. The rhetoric was vintage and violent at once. The assertion that certain people, by blood, by marriage, by color, were less fit for the coronation stages of wealth. Briana listened. She had the clinical calm of someone who had learned how to hold both breath and outrage. "What you did was cruel," she said simply. She did not scream, she did not plead. She described in small, exact sentences how the attack had felt and how the subsequent attempts to erase her were the true harm. "You hurt me," she said, soft but certain. Gloria's answer came wrapped in the language of preservation. "We had to act," she explained. "We had to protect the name." Her voice did not admit shame. When Briana named the assault as part of a campaign, when she articulated the careful removal of her invitations, the freezing of accounts, Gloria smiled like someone practiced at rewriting history. "It sounds worse when you say it like that," she told Briana, "but these are difficult choices." That evening, alone in her hospital room, Briana understood two things: the mechanism and the motive. The mechanism was the social machine that made a woman vanish to preserve a myth. The motive was uglier and older. The motive was uglier and older. The belief that certain faces did not belong center stage. It was the calculus of a dynasty unwilling to share the light. The news feeds were unkind in ways she hadn't anticipated. Journalists picked apart the timing of her presence at the gala. Opinion pieces debated whether a woman should have been in the public eye while pregnant. Her own supporters were careful on social media, hesitant to stand too close lest their names be associated and their donations audited out of existence. It felt, for the first time, as if her life's work had been reclassified as a risk rather than an asset. Days collapsed into one long, mediated humiliation. The foundation announced an internal review. The board gave priority to transparency. Her program administrative account showed a pending hold. Volunteers called to say they had been told to stay home. A cruel paragraph in a minor daily suggested erratic behavior and quoted anonymous insiders. The language of institutions was precise and clinical, neutral words doing violence. In the loneliness that followed, Briana realized she would have to decide whether to accept the leather folder's settlement and a quiet exit, or to compel the public to look at what had happened. The folder smelled like money and varnish, something designed to distract attention from the edges of shame. It promised quiet, it promised privacy, it promised a way for everyone else to move on as if nothing had happened. She remembered the faces of the children she tutored. Maya, who had read aloud with the brittle confidence of a girl who had been told she belonged nowhere in particular and decided to make a place for herself. The mothers who came to the clinic with defiant trust. They had not learned to expect the world to solve itself. They expected action. Briana's own ethics were a kind of stubborn practice, to keep showing up, to let the light in rather than to hide under flowers. When she told the brothers she was not sure she wanted to sign anything, Malcolm's voice tightened in a way that was not anger but focus. "Then don't sign," he said. "Let us do the rest." There was no showmanship in him. There was a plan. Forensic teams, media counters, legal filings. He spoke about the $2 billion lawsuit they would file as theater and leverage if need be.
An enormous, impossible number meant to shift the Foundation's calculations, to make the family think there was too much heat to withstand. "It will make them stop," Desmond said, "the accountant's cruelty of numbers used to create pressure." The three men worked like engineers who were building a bridge from a place where silence had been the only highway. Briana's role in the plan was not passive. She insisted on every step. She wanted witnesses interviewed in her presence. She asked for raw data. She wanted recordings preserved. She kept lists. She dictated emails in the gray hours before dawn. She wanted documentation. She wanted the chain of custody to be ironclad. Her brothers provided muscle and method, but she supplied the moral center. She was not a damsel waiting for rescue. She was a strategist who understood that power respected evidence. They agreed on a small, crucial thing. They would not be theatrical in a way that mimicked the Foundation's shame. They would let the law and the paper trail speak. It was a tactical choice as much as an ethical one. If the world wanted spectacle, they would give it documentation, the kind that judges and prosecutors could not ignore. The plan unfurled with quiet confidence. Isaac's team subpoenaed records. Malcolm's engineers secured metadata from the venue's security cameras. Desmond had accountants comb transaction histories. They set a date for a press release that would not be indefinite drama, but a clearing of facts. "We'll make them answer," Isaac said, the lawyer's rasp that made people uneasy. "Not because we want to humiliate, but because we need to stop this from happening to someone else." Meanwhile, Briana had to live in the space of the ordinary. Checkups, short walks, the quiet nights listening for the baby's kicks. She accepted Dr. Okonkwo's cautionary counsel: no long flights, limited travel, rest. The medical team insisted on continued monitoring of the fetus. They were careful, professional, and avoided false comforts. "We'll be rigorous," Patricia said, "but we'll also be honest." That honesty felt like a buoy. Yet threats piled into her inbox like winter storms. Anonymous accounts launched smear campaigns. A late-night blog post suggested an affair. A private investigator hired by an unknown source queried old landlords and ex-lovers. The family's PR machine, even as it attempted to spin, also leaked the small redundancies that would suffocate a nonprofit. Auditors with questions, donors who wanted distance, corporate chairs who wanted boards cleansed of drama. The privilege of wealth had a way of making removal elegant. Contracts tightened, roles rearranged. It had the appearance of process. It had the function of erasure. When the night came that made all the threads cross, it was quiet first. Briana sat at the small window in her hospital room, watching snow begin to shear the city into soft knives of white. She had spent the day signing consent forms for monitoring, and the night revising notes about the clinic's mobile library. She was thinking of Maya and a stack of unread books when Malcolm called. "We're leaving now," he said. The voice on the phone carried the weight of engines being started, the practical sounds of people who move things into motion. There was no theater in his tone, only purpose. "What do you mean?" Briana asked, though she knew the answer would not be a fairy tale. "We are going to land a plane on their lawn," Malcolm said. The sentence hovered between joke and declaration, and became, in that small breath, something like a prophecy. Briana could imagine it, a dark shape against the sky, its engines like growls under the clean silver. She could see boys and men in suits stepping down onto a manicured lawn. She could see a file, discreet, heavy-handed, not to cameras, but to people who would have to respond. She could picture, succinctly, the choice the family would have to make: fight in public or let the narrative crack. She closed her eyes and pictured Hope Amara before she had even been born, a child with a mother who had insisted that she would not be erased. In that moment, the jet was not spectacle. It was leverage. It was a tool the brothers wielded with the clinical calm of people who understood how optics and law combined. Still, there was the matter of how to present the evidence. Forensic metadata, Isaac said on a call with hospital room clarity. "Records from the Foundation's transfers, recordings, internal memos. We're not inventing things, we're documenting what's there." He sounded like a man holding an enormous ledger to the light and seeing every lie reflected in it. Briana's heart did strange things, beats that were the body's insistence on life, and also the body's recognition of the stakes. She felt both the primitive fear of being exposed again and the unusual relief that the plan was surgical and not theatrical. The plan did not promise a tidy justice. It promised exposure, the slow and messy kind that mattered. Before the brothers could execute the plan, a new pressure arrived, a begrudging internal ally. Detective Iris Coleman of the NYPD had been first on the terrace that night, a woman with an eye for human detail who had refused to let the scene be one more photograph in an album of unpunished things. She had watched the tape and recorded witness statements, and then watched as narratives blurred. She understood, in telescopic terms, how small social slights became legal obstacles. She found one person who had not been invited to forget the truth. Detective Coleman's involvement was not public. It moved in the slow gears of law. Subpoenas whispered into the right ears, custody of evidence secured, a tone of seriousness introduced that made the world sit up. She had been following the trail of an older case, one where social shame had triumphed over justice, and she did not want to see the pattern repeat. "We'll make sure the chain of custody is clean," she told Isaac over a secure line. "We'll make sure no one can say the files were tampered with." Her assurance was the kind of thing that mattered most in courtrooms where people's lives were weighed in printed paper. That night, Briana agreed to press forward. The hospital room filled with a certain quiet resolution. She was not handing her life over. She was documenting and demanding that the public see. She signed the release that allowed the brothers' teams to request footage, to preserve evidence, a legal gesture that felt like a vow. It was a small action and not a surrender. Outside, the jet's engines might already have been warming. There was a particular hum to engines starting, low, insistent, like a beast shifting in its sleep. It was not a dramatic sound until it had become unavoidable. When Briana listened, she felt the vibration in her chest as if the city itself were translating this into a single message, now or never. Her phone buzzed with one brief image, a photo from Malcolm, sent with no caption. A distant dot of light traced over a midnight sky, then the angular silhouette of a Gulf Stream, black and precise against the snow. She read the message twice. Her companions in the quiet room exchanged looks that were not victory, but a readiness to carry whatever the day would demand. Briana did not know what the world would do when the brothers walked down those stairs with their files. She did not know which cameras would run, and which would try to angle the story into a softer shape. She had traded the possibility of a gentle, private folding of life for the harsher sunlight of public scrutiny. She had chosen, with the same stubbornness she had once insisted her program teach to children who had been told they had no voice, to be visible. As winter pressed the city into hush, so too did the quiet resolve settle into the room, a decision to move toward confrontation with the precision of people who knew exactly how to document truth. Briana looked at the machines beeping, felt a kick in the night, and let herself think of the future, not as a place where she would be sheltered by money, but as a place she would build with her own hands. A clinic that would stand regardless of what polished portraits hung in marble halls. The engines outside, finally, rolled into a sound she could recognize for what it was: motion with purpose. The jet's lights blinked like punctuation against the horizon. In the hospital's small window, the wet city reflected back a streak of bright metal, and Briana felt, strange and steady, the relief that comes from choosing a fight worth fighting. If you want the full account of how power was exposed and what came after, stay with this story. There is more to see. The Gulf Stream's lights cut through the snow like punctuation marks. It touched down with a hush that felt almost vain on the manicured lawn of the Montgomery estate. Too small a sound for the consequences that would follow, and yet enough to turn the smooth surface of the night into a public stage. Engines cooled into a purposeful rumble. A set of stairs unfolded like a black curtain, and 3 men stepped out into the cold with a kind of exactness that belonged to those who had rehearsed their entrances. Malcolm's coat was unbuttoned despite the wind. He walked like someone who had practiced not being seen and then decided he would no longer hide. Desmond carried a slim case that made no show of its weight.
Isaac walked with the same legal patience he had used for depositions. Hands measured, eyes committed to reading faces. They crossed the lawn with courtiers behind them, technical directors who had secured camera files, forensic auditors holding hard drives in soft cases, and a small group of men and women with legal badges pinned inside their coats. There were no banners, no speeches, only the quiet arithmetic of evidence. On the terrace, the Gala had splintered into a different species of attention. The orchestra's strings had thinned to background hum, and the crowd had shifted shape, a body of people whose curiosity could be as sharp as a blade. Reporters leaned forward, phones rose, and the polished choreography of the evening found itself interrupted. For those watching, the jet's arrival was a question. Why now? For those who had prepared the case, it was an answer. Detective Iris Coleman stood near the exit, a silhouette against the door's warm glow. She had planned for this convergence. Her presence lent a calm that was administrative instead of performative. She coordinated discrete paths for evidence to move, and kept the press at a distance that allowed law to do what spectacle could not. When Malcolm's men presented their case, folders with chain of custody seals, time-stamped footage, bank records tagged and cross-referenced, Detective Coleman didn't look surprised. She had been watching for the pattern that binds intention to act. She had already secured warrants and prepared for the protocols that make an accusation into something prosecutors cannot ignore. The first documents were dry to the touch, ledgers annotated with transfers, references to discretionary oversight, a sequence of routing numbers that traced money from the foundation's endowment into accounts whose beneficiaries were obscured. Then came the metadata, camera files with time codes that undermined carefully curated timelines, security footage that captured the exact moments of name cards being shifted and servers rerouting stacks of envelopes. Isaac presented recorded conversations, voices speaking in the rooms where decisions were made, phrases that rearranged polite phrasing into orders. Legal language, he said, can be boring until it becomes a key. Tonight, it would open doors. Sloane Whitfield's entrance onto the terrace was a piece of theater she believed herself born for. White gloves, a pale face that had been landscaped for photography, a clutch that reflected light in the most flattering ways. She moved with practiced economy, exactly the person expected to perform contrition. But she was used to controlling frames. This time, the frame had been set by others. Malcolm's team released a recording with no fanfare, an audio file that, when listened to, exposed not only the mechanics of a plan, but the lightness with which it had been discussed. Sloane had laughed in the recording. Her laugh, recorded out of the curated context, landed heavy. Someone in the crowd shouted a question. Voices tangled in a chorus of surprise and accusation. Gloria's smile, earlier like a polished seal, faltered in a way that made its shape human. She took a step back as the room's attention shifted. This was the moment designed to show what happened when the invisible architecture of power is made visible, the polite cushions around cruelty removed, leaving only the raw seats of responsibility. Richard's posture changed first. In the hospital, he had been a man who traded gestures for damage control. Here, with the ledger in plain sight, his eyes looked like someone who had been asked to reckon with materials he could not manipulate. Malcolm caught his hand in a look that was more a precise ultimatum than a plea.
"You'll hand over the internal transfers you promised," Malcolm told him without a show of force, "or we'll let the prosecutors make the demand." It was not a threat, it was a choice between two legal realities: cooperation with some control, or confrontation with none. Richard hesitated the length of a breath, the private negotiation of his conscience visible like a map. He moved toward Gloria as if to block, and then stepped away. He had always been the man trained to stabilize narratives. Caught between maternal loyalty and his own calculating sense of self-preservation, he chose the leaner route of cooperation. He opened a small folder and slid it forward. Internal memos, email threads, bank correspondences that implicated the Foundation's senior officers in the root of money. It was the kind of thing Malcolm had warned him about. It left no room for plausible deniability. Detective Coleman accepted the materials into her custody with the professional calm of someone who has seen too many attempts at obfuscation to be swayed by theatrics. She then asked for Sloane's presence, and the crowd's camera lights, which had been waiting for drama, clicked eagerly into live consumption. Sloane, who had once been able to make every camera favor her, now felt the optics turn in a way that made her smile crack in private. Sloane's arrest was not cinematic in the way tabloid script arrests. It was procedural, legal, folded into the exacting steps that make a charge secure. Reading of probable cause, service of papers, a request for cooperation. She was taken aside by detectives who did not debate her public persona. In the hush of that aisle, a handcuff clicked, and the crowd's breath, which had been holding for spectacle, let out something small and astonished. It was justice in the form of meticulousness, not revenge. Detectives read her Miranda rights. The language was legal and neutral, empty of the moral language that had shaped the night's earlier cruelty. Sloane was being treated like any defendant in a public assault charge, with the presumption of process, with the evidence gathered to the point it could not be dismissed as rumor. Gloria's response unfolded differently. Without the ease of a single arrest, she faced a network of civil inquiries that could not be resolved with a single folding of hands. Her name surfaced in documents about donor diversions and oversight failures. Board members who had once deferred to her now had to sign statements. Invitations to galas were rescinded, not out of pique, but because boards and institutions began to distance themselves to avoid becoming collateral. Her social standing, always brittle, dependent on the sheen of the Montgomery name, cracked. The old money that had masked moral rot showed its seams. Calls that had once been answered immediately went to voicemail. Where she had used purity as a rationale, the public would now read a ledger. The press conference that the brothers' team organized later that morning was not triumphalist. Isaac, flanked by legal counsel and Detective Coleman, read a statement that was both simple and devastating in its method. A list of documents preserved, a timeline of events, an appeal to witnesses. He named no theater, he named a truth. Briana did not speak then. She had been in the hospital and had chosen to let the law do its first work. But her note of presence was visible in the faces of the forensic teams who had worked through the night to catalog every relevant piece of data. The tabloids, which had once reshaped her into a caricature of instability, now had a harder job. The transcript of phone calls could not be winked away. Magnetic ink and stamped chain of custody made legal avoidance complex. The lawyers issuing subpoenas did so with a thoroughness that stripped the sheen off the Foundation's PR. Friends who had been tentative now watched as the architecture of a cover-up, small decisions, rerouted funds, carefully phrased internal memos, unfolded under the light. Despite evidence moving the matter forward, the emotional decisions were not made for her. Briana had chosen visibility. She still had to live in its aftermath. The hospital was a small world of monitored beeps and measured reassurances. Dr. Okonkwo remained steady. "We're continuing to monitor," she said. "We'll be cautious, but the baby's heart rate is reassuring." When Briana closed her eyes and felt another kick, she understood how much of the fight was not public at all, but domestic. The everyday insistence of an expectant mother that she would keep this child safe with legal tools and with a clinic that would protect others. When the arraignment notice hit the wires and Sloan and name became the headline that morning, the world demanded a reaction. Sloan's PR team offered a statement that was confiscated by the legal process. They would not speak on pending matters. Sloan, meanwhile, would spend months in a rotation of custody hearings and depositions.
She was not, despite what some hoped, immediately erased. There are procedures and processes and rights that must be followed even when morality seems not to be on one side. But the swift legal attention made a public recalibration inevitable. Richard's fall, if fall is the right word, was more complicated. He remained a man with privileges that insulated him from some consequences. Yet his cooperation with the investigators required him to step down from the CEO role he had once occupied by lineage. It was a quiet abdication, a board vote preceded by calls and counsel, then a statement about stepping back to cooperate with ongoing inquiries and to seek help. He did not face criminal charges at that moment, but he had to give the investigators the material they requested. The public liked to see a single villain. This case had multiple complicating figures. Richard's cooperation was both pragmatic and morally correct, in the sense that it furthered the evidence gathering he had been paying his PR team to avoid. For some in the crowd, his partial redemption was not redemption at all, but a bargain. Before the public speech that would later change the tenor of the narrative, there were smaller reckonings. Volunteers who had been silent found their voices. Donors wrote letters asking for audits and restitution. The foundation's board resigned en masse, and its legal counsel entered negotiations to respond to subpoenas. Civil suits were filed by parties who wanted accountings and explanations. Gloria faced private depositions where she had to explain, under oath, the logic that had led her to call certain transfers discretionary. Her logic felt thinner under cross-examination than it had with the elegant polish of private conversation. When the lawyers cleared the immediate procedural hurdles, Briana prepared to face the crowd that had watched her be erased. The terrace where she had been struck became the stage where she would reclaim narrative. Malcolm had insisted on the timing, not before the investigators had the evidence, but soon enough to be meaningful. He insisted on one more legal check, not to prove anything theatrically, but to make certain that when she spoke, there would be no attempt to suppress the truth she named. The bones of the case had to be there to anchor her words. On a gray morning that had retained some of winter's menace, cameras angled toward the terrace again. Briana stepped out, wearing a simple dress that made no attempt to dramatize. Green, yes, but plain. Her hands were not gloved. Her belly was visible in the cut of the fabric, and she moved with a confidence that was not costume but self-possession. The crowd hushed in a way that made speech possible, not because they were kind, but because they had to be quiet for history that bore consequences. Her voice at first was a low sound, nearer to the cadence of a classroom than to the rhetoric of a podium. She started, not with the graph of pain, but with the names she had always kept. The volunteers, the mothers who had trusted a clinic in Newark, the child named Maya who had read The Little Engine That Could aloud and kept reading past the doubts she'd been taught by others. She spoke of the small things that had made her life whole, and then she told the crowd why silence is not neutrality. You may think silence protects you, she said, that staying quiet keeps a party's reputation intact, but silence is a choice, and it has consequences. The sentence landed not as accusation alone, but as an invitation to see the moral arithmetic of being a bystander. She spoke plainly about the attempt to erase her. The card moved aside, the name not mentioned, the trust rerouted. She named the language used by Gloria, purity, preservation, and said plainly that it was old language for old prejudice. Her speech did not call for pyres. It called for accountings. If we protect reputations by protecting wrongdoing, she said, then reputations become the armor of harm.
Her sentence was the distilled argument of her life, that a community is only as healthy as the stories it protects, and that protecting the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable is a moral failure. There were pitches of applause, but the sound that mattered was the quiet of people reconsidering. The speech asked a question of the room. What do you owe to each other, beyond your own comfort? It was a question that landed differently on rich shoulders than it did in the clinic's waiting room, and the difference mattered. Sloane, who watched from a ropes line between photographers and lawyers, did not look like a caricature. The camera did its job, in showing her face as a human face, and what the viewing public saw was young and complicated, practiced and defensive. Her statement later, an apology written with legal counsel's hand and delivered in a soft voice, did not magically restore her. She would spend years in mandated community service, in listening sessions held at the clinic she once tried to overshadow. She taught classes not to be absolved, but to be required to witness, to sit in circles and hear stories she had not wanted to hear. Her public mea culpa was the beginning of accountability, not its conclusion. Some members of the community accepted her contrition as the first step. Others refused, and that refusal was part of a healthy skepticism that Briana had encouraged. Gloria's fall from grace played out like the slow leaking of a once tight seal. Institutions that relied on the Montgomery name quietly revised press kits and mission statements. Civil suits sought the return of diverted funds. A handful of long-trusted board members testified, under oath, about the changes in the foundation's leadership. Where once her word had been the ledger, now paper showed transactions that required explanation.
She continued to travel in a smaller orbit, holding private grudges and reading the same social pages that used to flatter her. The position she had taken as arbiter of taste and belonging became a subject of legal inquiry and, more painfully, of social isolation. Richard, meanwhile, tried to reconcile the space between public penance and private consequence. He entered therapy publicly and offered to help fund the clinic's operations as restitution. He sent letters and a photograph of himself with a bouquet, and later a photo of a tiny boot near a sneaker in his apartment, a claim of involvement that some received as genuine and others read as performative. Briana refused a grand gesture of reconciliation. She accepted parcels of funding that were accounted for and monitored by independent trustees. That precise accounting mattered more than statements. She held to the principle she had always used in her clinic. Credibility is sustained by transparent actions, not just words. The months that followed were incremental and granular. Legal proceedings continued. Sloane's assault charges went through the court process with their slow, stuttering rhythms. Depositions were recorded, and statements made under oath shaped later filings. Gloria faced civil inquiries. The foundation's endowment was audited. Richard negotiated his role in restitution and pushed the board to be compliant. None of the outcomes was cinematic in the way tabloids love. There were no dramatic prison sentences paraded for cameras, no televised collapse of a dynasty within a single act. Instead, there was documentation, accountability, and the slow machinery of institutions doing their work when required. Briana did not rest. Between court dates and deposition schedules, she worked with her brothers to secure the clinic's future. Malcolm negotiated a legal vehicle that ensured the clinic's funds would be insulated. And Desmond worked to fund the Hope Amara Women's Health Center, named, not by accident, for the future Briana had carried through the storm. Isaac negotiated the parameters of oversight, insisting the center be run by community leaders rather than merely receiving funds that could be redirected. The brothers had provided leverage. Briana insisted on governance that would avoid the mistakes she had seen, boards that answered to money rather than to the people they served. Opening day at Hope Amara was small and honest. The paint was still fresh, the reception desk had a stack of donated children's books and an old rocking chair that someone had repaired and varnished. The clinic offered free maternal screenings, counseling, and a small legal aid desk. Mothers came with babies in slings and with histories that could not be reduced to neat sentences. There were volunteers who had stood by Briana in private. The nurse who had first trained at her clinic, an English teacher from Newark, a retired social worker who oversaw the volunteer schedule. For all the media attention that surrounded the case, the real miracle was quieter. People bringing dinner to the staff, neighbors shelling out to fix the clinic's broken sign, a local barista opening early to serve coffee to volunteers. Briana's labor arrived not long after the clinic opened its doors. It was a Tuesday night, quiet and soft. Dr. Okonkwo was there, calm and present, and the room filled with the small choreography of reproduction, measured breaths, trained hands, the slow hum of monitors that had once punctuated hospital nights. When Hope Amara was born, she did not cry as if startled by her own existence, but rather as if she were announcing it. Her voice cut cleanly into a world that had once tried to make her mother invisible. Briana held her daughter and felt the weight of the past and the promise of the future in the same small, fierce bundle. The photograph sent afterward of Briana with Hope, no filters, neither a staged portrait nor an editorial, traveled slowly at first, then with the contagiousness of simple truth. People who had watched the Gala's glitter began to see the contours of what had happened in more human terms, that a woman had been assaulted and then erased, and that action, law, and community had forced a reckoning. The clinic filled with women who wore scars of different sorts, economic injury, domestic violence, the quiet harm of being told one does not belong. They found the Hope Amara Center less like a monument and more like a working place that treated their problems with dignity rather than spectacle. Sloan's mandated community service placed her in rooms where she had to listen. She led a class on public accountability not as an exercise in PR, but as a mandatory reflection on what it meant to be someone in a position of influence. The sessions were hard for her. She attended with counsel, then alone, and learned that contrition in public is not performance, but labor, repeated, mundane, and often unobserved. She volunteered in the clinic's legal desk, handing out forms and then listening as women narrated their lives. For some survivors, her presence was unbearable. For others, it was a chance to reshape an antagonistic figure into someone who might one day be a witness for change. Briana did not tell people what to feel about Sloan. She only insisted that the systems that allowed harm be changed. Richard, who sent a single photo of his daughter taken from a respectful distance, was kept at the margins of family life. He visited in supervised settings, saw his child through check-ins arranged by legal counsel, and contributed to a fund that supported the clinic's ongoing missions. The public judged him in many ways. Some called him cowardly for his early inaction. Others noted that at least he had chosen cooperation over obfuscation. Briana governed nothing of his personal life. She chose to accept what benefits her community and to refuse anything she felt would entail moral erasure. Richard, who sent a single photo of his daughter taken from a respectful distance, was kept at the margins of family life. He visited in supervised settings, saw his child through check-ins arranged by legal counsel, and contributed to a fund that supported the clinic's ongoing missions. The public judged him in many ways. Some called him cowardly for his early inaction. Others noted that at least he had chosen cooperation over obfuscation. Briana governed nothing of his personal life. She chose to accept what benefits her community and to refuse anything she felt would entail moral erasure. There was, over the next year, a slow public education. Journalists who once wrote cheap headlines began to publish longer pieces on institutional complicity, how quiet erasers are manufactured, how donor relations can be weaponized, and how the facade of tradition can hide bigotry. A few philanthropic organizations changed their vetting processes. Some foundations added ethics boards. It was not a revolution. The changes were incremental and often halting. But for many in Newark who had watched Briana insist that children be taught to read and be given a chance to thrive, the clinic represented a practical promise, that the city's mothers now had one more place to go. Years later, at the clinic's 5th anniversary, there was a modest ceremony.
Hope Amara, now a talkative girl with a stubborn insistence on being seen, cut a ribbon with a giant pair of toy scissors. Briana spoke briefly about continuity, about how institutions must be patient with truth, and how visibility could be a form of protection. Malcolm, Desmond, and Isaac stood at her side, not as props, but as collaborators who knew how to use their resources for public good. Detective Iris watched from the back with a folded smile. She had been promoted, true, but she kept in her coat the kind of quiet competence that had made the earlier investigation possible. The legal matters that had once consumed news cycles had settled into a more private paperwork of restitution and civil negotiation. Sloane's public career in PR had ended. She taught and did service, and every time she spoke in a church basement or clinic room, she had to face the listening eyes of those she had harmed. Gloria retreated into the smaller orbit of private life, occasionally publishing op-eds that were read for the scandal they invited rather than the wisdom they hoped to claim. Richard sometimes sent a photograph of Hope's footprints on a beach, and once he sent a letter. Briana read it, filed it, and acknowledged its existence in the way of someone who keeps careful records. The closing scenes of the story were not perfect. There is no perfect in these matters. There is work, repeated and often boring, the ordinary work of feeding kids at the clinic, of teaching mothers their rights, of persuading donors that accountability preserves rather than destroys philanthropy. Briana spent her days doing that ordinary work, and her nights writing op-eds and advising local leaders. She turned down some public offers that wanted to make her into a symbol. She preferred the practical, the schedule of vaccinations, a new mobile van for literacy, and legal clinics that could help mothers navigate custody issues. Her leadership style was not performative. It was the slow accumulation of consistent acts. On nights when the work weakened her, she would stand at the clinic's small second-floor window and watch the city.
Once, when Hope was small enough to sleep on her chest, Briana felt the familiar kick and thought of the terrace where she had been struck and of the stairs the jet had unfolded like a dark hand. She still felt the remnants of that fear, but now it was braided with a steadier feeling, a sense that visibility had become a weapon for the vulnerable and not only for the affluent. She had learned, in hard ways, that truth could be aggregated like evidence, filed, time-stamped, cataloged, and that those files might be enough to break a pattern. In the end, the story that had begun with a white dress and a cruel kick concluded not with a grand courtroom verdict, but with the slow, legal and social unmasking of mechanisms that keep people quiet. There were apologies, legal consequences, and ongoing community work. Briana had not been rescued by spectacle. She had been supported by kin, by detectives who took evidence seriously, and by a legal process that finally had the documentation it needed. Her clinic, named for the daughter she had carried through violence, remained a beacon because it was built by people who understood how to translate visibility into protection. On a quiet afternoon, Briana sat in the clinic's small garden, Hope at her knees stacking blocks, and thought about the shape of silence. Silence, she told a volunteer who had asked about her earlier strategy, is comfortable for the powerful. It costs them nothing. It costs those at the margins everything. Her volunteer nodded, the lesson both sharp and practical. The clinic continued to be busy. The bookshelves remained full. The legal desk continued to provide measured counsel, and the women who had once felt erased came back to volunteer and to teach others. There is a final kind of justice not measured by indictments or resignations, but by the way communities learn to protect each other. Briana had learned to build that kind of protection. She had taught children to read, she had insisted on solid paper trails when wealth tried to rewrite the rules, and she had made a clinic that would outlast the news cycle. When she watched Hope run through the waiting room with a book in her hand, she did not see a victim's child, nor a symbol of triumph. She saw a child who would one day, perhaps, take a stand. Not because the world owed her protection, but because her mother had shown her how to insist upon it. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it.
If this subject matters to you, consider supporting local domestic violence or maternal health organizations, those organizations that do the patient work of keeping people visible and safe. The truth, in the end, was not merely that a private jet had landed on a lawn and truth had walked down its stairs. The truth was that visibility, paired with method and moral clarity, had been enough to begin to change a system that once preferred silence.